Well, hello there. How's everyone doing today? I cannot believe we are like in the third week of school already. Just remember, time goes by so fast, so capture all the time you can and don't get behind on your assignments in your class or behind on your reading, because it's like this. I have this analogy of this huge snowball at the top of the mountain, and it just starts gaining momentum, and it's going to roll down that mountain. It's going to eventually crash on top of you in a few weeks if you don't stay on top of it, because here we are, the third week of the semester already. Glad you're listening to this, and we're going to talk about some very specific research concepts today, so you may need to listen to this more than once. Go along with it in your book. Read those concepts, because this is the overarching paradigms of the research process that everything we do fits underneath. And the first approach we're going to talk about is the quantitative research approach, or what's considered the positivist way of thinking. So quantitative research, positivist way of thinking, those terms are interchangeable for all practical purposes within the research setting. When we think about the positivist way of thinking or the quantitative approach, oftentimes this is what we associate research with. We've learned to, back in grade school, we learned to make a hypothesis and create an experiment to test that hypothesis. Positivist way of thinking, or the quantitative approach to knowledge generation, is really what most of us have in our mind when we think about research, when we think about conducting those experiments. Now, this is actually more than simply numbers. Oftentimes, students will associate the term quantitative with numbers, and that is true. When we take the quantitative approach, we're actually using numbers, taking data, quantifying it in terms of numbers so that we can make some statistical analysis and some interpretations from that statistical analysis. But it's actually, this paradigm is more than just numbers. And the goals within this paradigm is to have measurability, to have objectivity, to reduce uncertainty, to be able to have duplication or replication, and the use of standardized procedures, which then moves back into providing objectivity, the ability to duplicate or replicate studies, and to reducing uncertainty. So we're going to break these concepts down, and we're going to talk about each one of them. But when we're talking about the quantitative approach or the positivist approach, remember, it is about numbers, and there's going to be statistical analysis involved in this approach. But the overall goal is not just about numbers. And so when we start talking about choosing research methodologies to investigate the phenomena we're wanting to look at, we have to have the understanding of what we're trying to go for here. So if we're wanting a more objective approach, one that could be replicated, one that might be generalizable, we're going to choose a positivist or a quantitative research method. The second method we're going to talk about in this presentation is going to be the qualitative approach, or the interpretivist, and it's a different paradigm, a different mindset in approaching knowledge development. So first of all, what does it mean to strive for measurability? Knowledge gained through this belief, this measurability, is based on objective measurements of the real world, not on someone's opinions, beliefs, or past experience. Remember, those are some other ways we have of gaining knowledge. But when we look for measurability, we want to be able to take a concept and measure it the same way each time. So the things believed to exist must be measurable from this standpoint. Researchers who utilize strictly a quantitative approach or a positivist approach will make the comment that everything is measurable. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So how do we measure things like love or respect or happiness? Mental health are issues that we measure. So how do we do that? Well, we actually come up with ways to identify variables that we can then create measurements that everybody agrees on. And when we start talking about variables and measurement, we'll get more into that. But we can actually define, or what we like to call operationalize. If we operationalize the concept of love, we make it measurable. So we could operationalize the concept of love by saying, or by creating a standardized instrument or a measurement to say, how many times does your significant other kiss you goodbye in the morning? If they kiss you goodbye 5 mornings out of the week, that indicates love. So from the quantitative approach, everything has to be measurable. We have to define it some way. One clear example of this is depression measurements. One of the most popular ones is Beck's depression inventory. So there's a series of questions or assessment that is used to assess a client's level of depression. If you score between this number and this number, then you're considered moderately depressed. If you score between this number and this number, then you're considered majorly depressed. There's ways to take these concepts and make them measurable. It requires quite a bit of work on the part of author or the creator of the instrument, but that's what we go for. When we're talking about quantitative research, we need to be able to measure our variables in some objective format. And sometimes we deal with variables that are very hard to operationalize and make measurable, but that's what we strive for when we're utilizing this paradigm to generate knowledge. Then we want to strive for objectivity, and that's that the things that are being observed and or measured must not be affected in any way by the person doing the observing or the measuring. So I know most of you have heard the concept of the Hawthorne effect, or people, when we're actually observing people or when we're actually conducting research with individuals, that they can be impacted just because they know they're in a research study. So what we try to do when we're using the quantitative approach is to strive for this objectivity. We want to be able to measure everything the same way, and it can't be affected by the researcher, by me, who is actually administering the tool. Those who are participants, we want to be able to have them to be as objective as possible and not impacted by just knowing that they're in the study. So this is a challenging approach. This is challenging in this approach, but it is something that we strive for, this objectivity. So it's very important to make the measurements and the variables that are operationalized created in a manner so that it doesn't reflect the researcher and it doesn't reflect the participant. It's actually a neutral measurement and objective in that manner. And when we talk about uncertainty, in the positivist approach, the goal is to totally rule out uncertainty. And so what this means is, let's use the example of we are working at an agency that treats clients for their levels of depression. And we have measurements. We have operationalized depression through a standardized instrument. So when they enter our program, we administer a pre-test or a pre-measurement to see what level their depression is at. They go through our 4-week program, and then we administer the test again to see what level their depression is at, to see if there's anything that has changed between when they began the program and when they ended the program. Obviously, we want their depression to be gone or greatly reduced because of our program. But what we don't know is, was it our program that reduced their depression or made that impact, or are there other variables that potentially could have impacted their level of depression and changed it, and it wasn't the program? When we use quantitative approaches, when we use the measurability and the objectivity, we actually are working to reduce the uncertainty that there are other variables that we don't know about that are changing the client's level of depression. Obviously, we don't want to continue to charge clients or charge their funding sources to provide an intervention that may not be working. We want to be able to say it's our intervention that's having the success, and we want to eliminate any other variables out there that could potentially be making that difference so that we can show it's our intervention. So this is how we try to reduce uncertainty through this objectivity and measurability that we use within the quantitative approach. Then the aspect of duplication or replication. To clarify this, when we talked last week, we talked a little bit about the research question. And if the research question had already been answered, then how were we going to justify conducting a study to answer it again? Well, part of the paradigm of the quantitative approach or the positivist approach is we do want to strive for duplication and replication. But what this means is we want to design our studies in a way that they're measurable, they're objective, so that another researcher could then replicate our study in a different population to see if they get the same outcomes. So let's go back to the concept of having an agency that treats depression. We have the most wonderful intervention that has ever been created. We think it truly solves depression. We're going to eliminate depression in the world with the intervention that we have. We create the study so that it can be replicated. And when we talk about writing up our results and disseminating the information, we also have to write to a level of detail so that somebody else can read it and again replicate our study. So we're using this particular intervention with individuals who live in a very rural area of Texas. And somebody, a researcher in New York, wants to see if our intervention is then going to be as effective with individuals who live in a very urban area. So they take our intervention and our study measures, our objectivity, our measurements, the whole process, and they apply it to that particular population. So then they replicate our study or our evaluation of our intervention to see if it has the same impact on that population. So this is an important part of knowledge generation. You can't conduct a study just one time and say that it is the gold standard for that knowledge development. Studies need to be replicated over time to make sure the findings are going to be the same each time it's conducted. This gives strength and credibility to the findings from those studies. So we strive for duplication when we're using this paradigm. And then we strive for the standardized procedures. And what this means is that we want to produce results that are going to be credible, that are going to be accepted by the experts and practitioners. And so we have to use the scientific standardized procedures when setting up our study design to ensure that we have the measurability, the objectivity, and the ability to replicate or duplicate the study. So there's a process when you're creating and designing a research study from a quantitative approach, and you go through these specific steps to be able to do that, and then that adds again more credibility to those areas that we're looking at to being able to produce measurability, objectivity, and replication. So let's take a few minutes and let's just kind of break down those steps within this quantitative research approach. But what I want you to understand as we're going through this is not necessarily a linear process where you go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4 and finish each one before you move to the next. In reality, until the point where you begin to gather your data, you actually may kind of go back and forth and refine within each of these steps. It's linear because you have a starting point and you have an ending point, but within that process you may go back and forth a little bit. In the quantitative approach, though, it's very important to understand once the research has been designed and once the data collection has been initiated, at that point you don't go back and change anything within these steps. Then it is set and you just can't change it, because if you do, then you're going to reduce your objectivity and you're going to reduce your credibility in that. So the first step is problem identification, and you identify a general problem to study. If you're coming from a pure research approach, remember a pure research approach is from the perspective of just producing general knowledge. It's just forming theories and advancing the professional knowledge, versus the applied research approach where we're actually coming from a standpoint of a problem identification and we want to identify an intervention that's going to be successful to alleviate that problem. We have to have problem identification, and this is the first step in the research process, where then we begin to take this and move it into a research question that could be answered or that could be tested. Oftentimes from social work, problem identification comes with what we work with on a daily basis. An example of problem identification of what we work with on a daily basis, I can go back to when I was working in physical inpatient rehab. Most of the patients that we were seeing that were coming into rehab were older individuals, geriatric individuals. We treated individuals who had orthopedic, either elective surgeries or injuries, hip fractures, neurological insults, oftentimes non-traumatic brain injuries from strokes, from different areas like that. So what I began noticing in working with this population is I had several situations where it was the husband who experienced a very sudden catastrophic event. So the husband was fully functional and they had a very severe stroke that rendered them incapacitated cognitively. They weren't able to speak, process information. And then their wives would have become the head of the household because the husband could no longer do that. In these particular relationships, the husbands had always been the head of the households and the wives were kind of lost. I actually had some of the spouses, the wives, who had never put gas in their car and never wrote a check, and then all of a sudden their husband is rendered incapacitated. So it made me start thinking about, well, how do they make that switch? How do they become the head of the household and make all these decisions when their husband is still alive? He has not passed away, which brings in different dynamics, but yet he's rendered incapacitated. And knowing from working with older individuals that exploitation, financial abuse, and all of that just runs rampant, it really got me to thinking about how does this happen and what kind of supports do these individuals need, or these women need, as this occurs to them. So this was a problem identification that came out of my practice that in turn I then created a question for it and actually implemented a study to determine what happens here. Okay, when we formulate initial impressions, what we're actually doing is we're actually doing variable identification, or selecting specific variables that would impact whatever the question is or the problem area that we're wanting to explore. The example that's used in the book in terms of racial discrimination within public social service agencies, and it breaks it down into a hospital setting, and where a social worker has noticed that individuals with ethnic minority backgrounds and have high unemployment rates, a large portion of their members living in poverty, and low levels of educational attainment may be more likely to use social services within this setting. So the three variables that the social worker begins to look at is unemployment, that's a variable, living in poverty, that's a variable, and the level of education attainment, that is a variable. So now we actually have this general problem area that we're looking at, and then we're starting to refine and formulate those initial impressions of what the variables may be that are impacting within this general research question that we have. The third step in this process is, once we've done that, then we want to determine what others have found out about the area that we're looking at. And I challenge students every semester, I challenge you to find some topic that has not been researched at some point in time. Now, it could be a topic that maybe hasn't been researched from a social services perspective, but I promise you there's research out there about it. The area that I research and am engaged in at this point in time is actually artificial intelligence and social companion robots. You're not going to find anything about that within the social work literature at this point in time. There's a very little of it within sociology, not really in psychology. Most of it is coming from some new disciplines that are emerging in terms of robotology, robot ethics, So I'm actually delving into other professions to see what they know about and what they have found out, and then I'm going to garner that over into the social work profession. So what we do is we look for a variety of sources from professional journals, empirical studies that are published, credible websites, and we'll talk a little bit more about what makes a website credible, and books, but not so much books as we look at the evidence from professional journals. And the reason of this is, if you'll take an example, if you'll look at your textbook, and if you'll look at the textbook that we use here for research, this Research Methods for Social Workers, it's edition 12, the concepts in here and the citations that are used are several years old. They're not newly generated information. This is because it takes a long time to write a textbook, and so by the time it's actually written, edited, and published, then the information in it is usually outdated. So that's just an example of why textbooks are not always the best resources to be used within writing in developing a research study. Now, if there's some theoretical perspectives to it, theories come out of textbooks. Again, those concepts that don't really change over time can come out of textbooks, but those aren't your best resources here. Credible websites, and these include things that you want to look for, .org. That typically is going to mean that it is a nonprofit website. A .edu, which is an educational website. You want to avoid the .coms, the things that are very common, the .nets. Credible websites need to be from a government organization. It could be .gov. Again, a nonprofit, something that's well known. You can't just take information off any website to determine what others have found out about your topic and then think that it's going to be credible. Professional journals, and this is what you get through the online library. You actually get publications that are in professional journals. These really should be peer reviewed, because when they're peer reviewed, then it adds an extra level of credibility to the findings in there. So what happens is, once you have this general idea, this general problem area, you've identified some of the variables that you think are going to impact this general problem, then you begin looking at what's published out there about this concept, about this phenomenon, about this problem. What do others know about this? This is what we call a review of the literature. And so we want to review the most recent studies that have been published. The rule of thumb here is you actually want to look at stuff that have been published within the last 10 years. And when you're doing this, you want to make sure that the data was gathered within this last 10 years. And the reason for this is because sometimes you may have a study that's published in 2019, but the data they used actually came back from 1998. Now, that's kind of an unusual situation because the data is so old, but there are reasons to do that sometimes. So when you're looking for credible information, using the online library, using some websites are best for very current statistics. Most of your statistics now are going to come from websites because those are updated and can be updated quickly, as opposed again to like the textbooks that we talk about. If you have some of your textbooks and they're quoting statistics in there, I can promise you they're way outdated. So the best resource for statistics, current statistics on any population you're looking at, or the variables you're looking at, are going to be found off of the websites, like the .gov websites or the .org websites. Just know that as you're doing the review of the literature, it takes a while to develop some good skills to be able to do this, because you really have to organize, you have to know what variables you're looking at, you have to know the best places to go to get the information. So this can be pretty overwhelming. I always use the example that, technology has been such a great resource, and so the most wonderful thing about like our library, our online library, or through the internet, is you have access to all the information across the whole world. An amazing development over the last few years compared to when I went to school 150 years ago. I had to go to the library, I had to go to the card catalog, I had to find what I needed, I had to go upstairs, I had to try to find the journals, so it was very time consuming there. Now, the worst thing about technology is that you have access to everything all over the world. You really have to develop organizational skills to be able to do good, thorough literature reviews without becoming so overwhelmed with all the information that you have at your fingertips. So this is an ongoing developing skill process, lifelong learning process, the way that technology advances. And so you're going to be doing a lot of this within our program. So I hope you approach it from the standpoint of not just doing the literature review to satisfy the assignment, but also to be recognizing that you're in the process of doing skill development here for looking for credible information, because you're going to need those skills as you become practitioners also. So now that you've actually delved into the literature and you've learned what others know about it, at this point you're going to refine, and you can decide what research questions you're going to ask for your study. Start now, again, refining this area. It's not as broad as it was when you started looking at it. It's getting down to narrowing it down to those variables that you're going to want to explore. And this is based on what you've learned from reading what others have published about your topic. You are not creating something in a vacuum. You're going to stand on the shoulders of others who have gone before you. They've done work before you, and it's important that you use the work that they've done to build upon. Now, when you do that, you have to be sure and give credit and citations to everybody that you're using. But you want to do that. You want to use others' findings, the research others have done, to build your research on. So this is where you begin refining that general problem area. You're going to refine that question. You're going to refine those variables and how you're going to measure those variables. And this is all based upon what you've learned from others. Then, once you get to this point and you're narrowed things down and you know which variables you're going to be gathering data on, you have to operationalize your variables. So let's say you're going to pursue this concept of racial discrimination in social service agencies, and homelessness could be a potential part of that. It can be low socioeconomic status, low educational attainment, lack of employment. Anytime you're looking at one concept and your concept is racial discrimination, but there's all of these other factors that go into that concept, that's your variables, you need to be able to have all of those be measurable. You won't ever just have a study where you just gather on the variable of racial discrimination. This is what it is. You're always going to gather data on other variables, because remember, we want to reduce uncertainty. So we want to either include those variables in our explanation or be able to exclude them as part of our explanation. So you're going to actually gather data on a variety of variables to investigate that one topic you're interested in. The other thing that's very important to always remember is you need to build in demographic data or demographic variables. You need to have an understanding of gender, geographic area possibly, of age, again, the socioeconomic status, the educational level, the marital status, the number of children, whatever that could be, because any of these demographic variables could also be impacting the area that you're looking at, and you won't know if you don't gather that. By gathering the demographic variables of all your participants, you also get a picture of what your sample is, and you're able to describe what your sample population was like. So you'll always include demographic variables along with the other variables that you need to measure to help explain that problem area you're looking at. Once you've done all of that and you have a fairly good idea of those variables you're looking at and what the overall problem area is, and you've narrowed it down to 1, 2, 3 research questions or a hypothesis, you have to decide on who your sample is going to be. So you have to decide which individuals you need to have access to get information from to be able to answer your question. If you're going to be looking at the study about possibly ethnic discrimination or racial discrimination within social services setting, you're going to want to gather individuals who obviously use social services or whatever social services you've identified that have minority status in terms of racial and ethnic defining qualities, And you actually may want to gather on individuals who are of the majority, not the minority, to see if there's a difference between those two using the social services. So you have to decide who your population is going to be. And once you decide that, then you have to decide how you're going to solicit their participation or how you're going to select that sample. We'll have a section where we'll talk about the different sampling methods, and there's probability and non-probability sampling, but we'll talk about that. But also, too, think back to what you've already reviewed in the last couple of weeks in terms of the ethics of selecting individuals and soliciting participation and how that happens, because all of those things that you've learned up to this point also too will go into this process in terms of your sampling population and how you're going to get individuals to participate. Remember, we don't use deception. We always use informed consent, and all of that has to be built into this step 6. So when we decide on how we're going to get a sample, then we consider all of those ethical and cultural considerations. Then once you have your research, your evaluation, whatever it is, totally designed from beginning to end, you have your general problem area refined, you have a good solid review of the literature that provides that foundation for the variables that you're going to be exploring and the methods that you've chosen. You know who your sample population is going to be. You have a plan worked out as to how you're going to solicit their participation, how many people you're going to need, all of that information. Everything is all worked out, refined, fine-tuned, down to the final detail. Then it's time to talk about how you're going to collect the data. So not only do you have to have all of these steps in place, then it's like, okay, now how am I going to collect the data? Because once data collection starts, then the study's underway, and you can't change anything at that point in time. So data collection procedures have to be established ahead of time, and then they shouldn't be changed once you actually start the data collection. So we're going to break down ways to collect data in future weeks, but this is one area too that you're going to determine how you're going to collect your data. And we actually do this through surveys. We use questionnaires in the survey methodology. And it's going to be important. We talked a little bit a couple of weeks ago about the important semantics in research. And so when we're talking about research, survey is a methodology. A questionnaire is a data collection tool. So collecting the data, we could use a survey method and use a questionnaire. We can use the pre-test, post-test method, which is a group research design. So we're going to talk about different group research designs, which are ways to collect data. We can do a single system design, which is a way to collect data. So we actually have, within the quantitative approach, we have several methodologies or methods, ways that we can collect our data. And that's what we have to decide before we move forward and actually start doing it. So that triggers our actual implementation of collecting the data. So then we have everything in place, and it's time to actually go out and administer our questionnaires or begin our group processes with our pre-test and our post-test. We start gathering the information. Once we gather all the information, we have all the participants that we needed, and we have all the information, we're going to start analyzing the data. And we do this in the quantitative approach. We use statistical methods to do this. So we're going to enter this data into some computer system. I typically teach using Excel, so we're going to enter it in there so then we can then begin to analyze our results. Analyze the data. We're no longer collecting data, it's stopped, and then we enter the information and we start to analyze it. After we've done the statistical analysis on it and we have all of our results, then we start interpreting the data. And at this point, we go beyond just stating the facts and the results, but we make some conclusive statements. You're going to hear throughout the program, as you're in the program, and you're learning to write the papers from a social work technical perspective and using your citations and all of that. We're going to tell you at this point, your opinion doesn't matter. And that's kind of hard for us to hear sometimes, but from a scientific objective approach, you're learning from others, and you can have an opinion about what you're learning, but you cannot interpret their information. Once you actually conduct your own research study, you've gathered your own data, you've put everything into place, then you make interpretations about your data. It's at that point in time when you start to become an expert in an area. Until you've actually generated the knowledge yourself, you're not considered an expert to the point where you can actually make statements without giving somebody else the credit. At this point in time, in step 9, is when you actually begin to make conclusive statements about the results that you obtain from your study. Now, these statements are then again based back into, it's kind of like closing the loop, and how this connects back to what others have known about the topic. How is yours similar? How is yours different? And that takes us to step 10, which is closing the loop, and it's how does your results support other studies? How are they contrasted from other studies? What was different about what you did versus what other studies did? So then it becomes full circle, and you're now contributing to knowledge of the profession to alleviate some form of general problem. That's what's important about the research process, is we actually have this continuation knowledge development that's going on. So it's almost like a conversation that's happening through published research. Once you get to this point in your studies, then you have contributed to the knowledge. To do that, you actually have to write and disseminate your results. And if you remember from an ethical standpoint, I mean, we have an ethical obligation to do this. If we're going to collect data, and if we're going to analyze it, and if we're going to use it to actually inform practice or inform any of the interventions we're doing, ethically, we need to be sharing that information. Or if we've actually found out that there's an intervention that's not working like it's being proclaimed to work, we need to share that information. And we should be sharing that information accurately and in sufficient detail so that others understand it. Contributing to knowledge development is an ethical obligation for all of us in the social work profession. So we have to learn to write and disseminate a study's results. And it could be a program practice evaluation within your agency. It could actually be a research study from the aspect of the pure theoretical approach. It could be applied on a larger level. But it's important that we write and disseminate our results. And when you're doing it from a positivist and a quantitative perspective, then again, there's rules in how you do this, and you'll be learning those in terms of how you report your results. Okay, so we went through each of the steps in a very general sense, not very detailed, but as we move forward and we look at the different types of methods to actually conduct research, we'll break down those steps more and more in future weeks. But understand that the primary steps, you're going to have some going back and forth as you're developing this proposal for a study that you want to implement. From the quantitative approach, once you begin data collection, then the other steps don't change. Everything gets put into place at that point in time. It's locked down. You begin your data collection, you do your analysis, you interpret your results, so you don't go back and forth anymore. Until you begin data collection, you may actually continuously do some of the refining across those steps that we've talked about. It's very laborious, as you can possibly see. It takes a lot of problem solving, creative thinking, lots of reading, investigation in terms of the literature, but it can be fun. It can actually be like putting a puzzle together. And then it really is fun when you get your data and you get your information and you start analyzing your results. And my experience has always been is like, I'm way off. I get results I never thought I would have gotten. And then that's kind of fun. That discovery is there. This is just a brief overview of the quantitative approach, or what's called the positivist approach, steps within that. Remember, we're looking for objectivity. We're looking for measurability, We're looking for being able to replicate it. We're looking for the use of standardized instruments because we want to reduce uncertainty when we're trying to explain the focus of our research study. The other overarching paradigm within the research process or the scientific process is what's called the qualitative approach, or the interpretist way of thinking. And the qualitative approach actually has roots back in anthropology and ethnography. Also a scientific approach, but it doesn't contain the components, or we're not striving for the same components that we do if we're using the quantitative approach. The quantitative approach, again, is about objectivity and measurability. The qualitative approach is actually about the lived experience of the individual. So from the qualitative perspective and the qualitative paradigm, this approach is that research studies are subjective, not objective. So we look at the subjective reality of individuals' lived experiences and not at the objective, where it's measurable and replicatable. So based in the qualitative, or what's the interpretive paradigm, the only really way to find out about a subjective reality is to ask the participants and to get the answer in words, not numbers. The difference between these two approaches is, from the quantitative approach, we actually take the human experience and break it down to quantities or to numbers. From the qualitative approach, we hold on to the fact that we have to have in-depth explanations, in-depth stories from actual individuals to have an understanding of what that phenomena is like. These two different approaches are used for two very different reasons. You will have some researchers who are 100% quantitative. Remember, everything is measurable. If you can't measure it, then it doesn't exist. And you'll have some researchers who are 100% qualitative, and they will argue that you cannot break down the human experience to numbers and make sense out of it. You can only make sense out of the human experience by interacting in depth with the actual human. And those are the two extremes of the scientific approach. The mixed methods approach, you employ both of these to get a thorough understanding of the subject. In social work, we tend to fall in towards that middle. We use quantitative and we use qualitative, and we feel like a mixed methods approach, when possible, is the best approach to actually being able to understand any of the general problem areas we want to look at. So in the quantitative approach, there's typically one reality, and the example in the book talked a little bit about racial discrimination or some ethnic discrimination. In the qualitative approach, there's multiple realities. There's more than one reality. Feminist theory is very much built from a qualitative approach, and they argue that men and women experience the world differently, and so they both exist in different realities. So men and women who are working in the same job, let's say the same job description, they're both engineers, and they both work for the same company, and they both been there the same amount of time, and they have the same education. Well, the concept from a qualitative approach is they're going to experience that from very different realities based on their gender and their perceptions. A qualitative researcher who's pure in the qualitative research would say you cannot make their experience measurable and be able to measure it so that it is the same. This is the qualitative approach, and they would say that they bring their own perceptions even though all those variables are the same within this concept. The other aspect of qualitative research has to do with the changing realities. And from this approach within the research study, there's the researcher's reality and the interpretation of what's happening. There's the participant's reality, and then there's a mutual or shared reality that they create together. So this is a concept, again, the subjectivity and not the objectivity. Quantitative, we want to remove these aspects so that we can be more, reduce any uncertainty. But in qualitative, we recognize that the researcher brings a reality, the participant brings a reality, and then just engaging together creates a new reality. Another aspect that is, again, semantics within the qualitative is subjects versus research participants. Typically in the quantitative approach, participants are referred to as subjects. But now I'll argue, even within the social work perspective, we don't break down the participants to subjects. We actually call them research participants. But it's definitely in the qualitative approach, they're seen much more as active participants and not just subjects of the data collection. So the participant becomes a very important data source, and it's not just a standardized instrument that's being used. They're actually participating in the process and the development of the data and the creation of the knowledge. In the qualitative approach, the researcher's values must be acknowledged and explored thoroughly. And when you read qualitative studies, you'll see some of this, because it's the researcher's values shape the trajectory of the research process and the interaction they have with their participants. So it has to be understood, it has to be acknowledged, and it has to be recognized. To qualitative researchers, immersion in values is necessary so that their inevitable effect is understood and their research participants' realities emerge more clearly. So this is an acknowledgement that the researcher is bringing their own values to this, and it is going to have an impact on the outcome study. If you think about watching the pregnancy project, and if you think about the blurring of Gabby's values and then the others in the study, you can see how by not approaching it from the standpoint of actually recognizing what her values were in terms of believing teen pregnancy is not a barrier or should not be a barrier to future progress, and that it's the labeling that actually harms individuals. Having that from a qualitative perspective and recognizing that that's what she brought with her would help in sifting through and having a better understanding of those others who were actually in the study. Some common things of qualitative studies, commonalities of all the qualitative studies, they're conducted primarily in natural settings where participants carry out their daily business. You have a non-research atmosphere. And again, from social work perspectives, we really don't work in a laboratory setting. So we do work in a real-world atmosphere. Variables cannot be controlled and experimentally manipulated. So again, they're not operationalized to the point that they have standardized instruments to measure them. Those are not used in qualitative studies. Questions to be asked are not always completely conceptualized before data begins. And what this means is, like we said in quantitative research or the positive perspective, everything has to be decided and locked down before you start gathering your data. In qualitative, that's not the way it is. So you actually may have some research questions in mind that you're going to be using. And as you begin to get that really rich, in-depth data and the lived experience of the individuals that you're going to be interviewing or working with, you may refine, you may change your research question, and it may be conceptualized differently, and this is perfectly acceptable within this process. Data collected are heavily influenced by the experiences and priorities of the participants, and again, we're not administering standardized measures. We're allowing each participant to define whatever we're asking them to define and how they've lived that experience. Meanings are drawn from the data using processes that are more natural and familiar. And data analysis in qualitative research is very tedious because you're actually looking for words and phrases and themes. It's not breaking it down through very structured statistical methods. So it's more about actually reading the words and the things that the participants have told you and coming up with the commonalities in that. The phases within the qualitative process are going to be a little bit different than within the quantitative process. And again, in the qualitative process, they're not as clearly defined as they are in the quantitative process. So phase 1 and 2, which is problem identification and question formation. When you do this, you begin qualitative from your own observations or your own hunches about what you're seeing out there. When you do the literature review, it comes from a different perspective. You look for those key concepts and you see how they might be described by previous researchers, but you don't rely on the literature review or what's been done before to define those variables or to identify measurable ways to do those variables. The other aspect of the literature review is it's not something that you do complete and then move to the next step. In qualitative, you're going to go back and forth in the literature as you're gathering information and you're getting more in-depth understanding of these key variables and these key concepts you're looking at. You're going to return to the literature and you're going to see what else is there. So this is much more of a intertwined process in a qualitative study than it is in a quantitative study. In designing the research study, it's really aimed at the in-depth understanding of a few cases rather than a general understanding of many cases or many participants. So from qualitative, you're going to have far fewer participants. You could have 2 to 3 participants. You could have maybe 10 participants. But because you're gathering such in-depth rich data from the individuals, you don't gather it from a large number of people. Quantitative, using again questionnaires, survey methodology, you can engage hundreds of thousands of people, but qualitative, it's just from a select few individuals. In collecting the data, the researcher is actually the principal instrument of data collection. So like in quantitative, your data collection tool may have been a pre-designed questionnaire, may have been a standardized instrument. When you're collecting the data from a qualitative approach, then the researcher is actually the data collection method. They're the ones who are actually recording the information. It's an interactive collection of data. And so there's interaction that's happening between the participant and the researcher, and it's immersed in the context or the setting of the study. So again, you're going to actually be within that environment when you're collecting the data. It's actually important that the researcher becomes aware of their own biases. Again, like we talked about, the qualitative approach recognizes that the researcher brings a subjective aspect to the study, and then that's recognized as part of that data collection process and that data collection interpretation. The data collection is a two-way street in qualitative. So the participants tell their stories, and then the researcher turns around and tells them, this is my understanding of what you're saying. So it's an iterative process. It's back and forth. And it also involves multiple data sources and multiple data collection methods. So there's some triangulation that happens here to try to make this qualitative approach, I don't want to say more credible or more objective, because that's not what it is, but you actually want to get data from multiple sources to see how they actually complement each other. And again, analyze and interpret the data is very different from the quantitative approach. So analyzing qualitative data is an iterative one. There's volumes of data collected that are read and reread, looking for patterns, looking for themes that you want to capture. The goal is to interpret the data in a manner to capture the true expressions of the participants. And there's some different ways to do that. There's a phenomenology approach, there's a grounded theory approach. So it's not just a haphazard reading. There's actually some structured approaches to interpreting this. But this is volumes and volumes of words and information that you have to go through, and you have to read, and you have to reread, and you have others read it. so that you see if you're identifying the same type of themes in here. I love qualitative, or let me say, I love the concept of qualitative research. I think it is rich and I think it is so interesting, and I would love to be a qualitative researcher. But when I sit down and I actually try to go through the volumes of information that is there, I would rather pull my fingernails out. It is so tedious. So I love to read and I love to reread, but in terms of using this to do interpretive work from, I'm just in awe of anybody who does it, but I've come to realize it's not going to be me. I like to imagine myself as a qualitative researcher, but the reality of it is I'm not going to be able to have the focus to do that. I can do the statistics all day long. I get that. I understand that. I can do that. This qualitative research, I think, contributes so much knowledge to what we do as professionals. And I'm so thrilled others are going to do it, but this is not my strength. And again, because of the way it's done, it's lengthier when compared to quantitative studies. It's lengthier in setting it up. It's lengthier in gathering the information. It's lengthier in interpreting it. It's lengthier in writing it. So it's just much more involved because it comes from the personal perspective and the lived experience of that individual, and you have to be able to capture all of that. So it's much more involved and takes much longer than to conduct a quantitative study. So when you're determining which one of these you want to use, this also has to be taken into consideration in terms of a time frame, feasibility, cost, all of that. The philosophical differences between quantitative and between qualitative can the experiences be described objectively, or do the experiences need to be described subjectively? Scientific principles, rules, and tests of sound reasoning are used to guide the research project in quantitative versus capturing the whole experience of just a few individuals in qualitative. In quantitative, value suspension versus the researcher's values and beliefs being a part of the actual process. So we actually try to remove values in the objective quantitative approach. In the qualitative, we recognize that values, beliefs, and experiences are going to influence the process. Quantitative, we try to strive so that we can generalize our findings to a larger population. In qualitative, we just want to tell the story of a few. Knowing that when we talk about the knowledge level of continuum here, all concepts have generally started out from a qualitative perspective. So one of the examples I want to use is if we go back to the early 1980s when the disease of AIDS was discovered. It was very new. We did not know how this would affect the social psychological aspect of individuals who became ill with this. So there was a lot of qualitative research that was done over that period of time to gather the lived experiences of those individuals diagnosed with AIDS, HIV/AIDS. From there, the themes and the reoccurring similarities evolved into the different variables that we now measure on a quantitative basis, and we have a very, very strong understanding of how HIV/AIDS impacts an individual and their family. It started from a qualitative perspective, which is more exploratory. It's the lived experience, and from that we refine the concepts, we refine the variables, and we make them into quantitative measurability. So most all phenomenon that we're measuring, like depression with Beck's depression inventory, that began from a qualitative approach. So this is kind of a progression that we have. So when we look at it from a social work perspective, if we can include both of those in our investigation, we get the best of the both worlds. But you can imagine how time-consuming and potentially expensive it can be to use a mixed methods approach where we have a qualitative approach and we have a quantitative approach. It's the best of both worlds if we can do that. So we've actually kind of gone over the similarities and the differences between quantitative and qualitative. And again, using both of those approaches in a single study is a mixed methods design, and it's from social work perspective, we feel like it's the best of both worlds. There's advantages to each one depending upon what you're wanting to look at, where the knowledge level is, what approach you're needing to take to get the information you need to solve the problem you need to solve. And there's disadvantages of each one. So neither one are just the perfect optimum way to go. There's always trade-offs when we're actually trying to investigate phenomenon and have an impact on knowledge development. So understanding each one of these, the purpose for using quantitative versus qualitative, the trade-offs within there helps to inform you so that you then, when you need to investigate, when you need to do a program practice evaluation, then you will have the knowledge you need to make a decision about the best one to use and the best one to employ.